name's Dr. Ski Chilton, and I'm the author of this little book right here called The Rewired Brain. I want to spend a few minutes with you tonight at my dinner at my favorite restaurant, just telling you a little bit about my book and a little bit about why I wrote this book. You know, almost 10 years ago, I was really at a crucial point in my life. On one hand, I was this internationally recognized scientist. I was the head of several organizations in Africa, taking care of African orphans. I was in Sudan, and we were taking care of people who were running from genocide. And on the other hand, back in the US here, my life was an absolute mess. I'd been a failure at my relationships. My family had experienced several devastating tragedies. I was absolutely unwilling to continue to live with these disconnects in my life. On one hand, how in the world could I love people all over the world and be this humanitarian? And on the other, how could I be such a failure in the things that mattered the most to me, the relationships? How could I be hurting so many people around me? At that point, I began a journey. Now, I already had a lot of the scientific expertise. I worked on the human genome, and I understood genetics and all the genetics behind brain wiring, and I understood a lot about the brain. I then began to study philosophy, and I came upon this concept that was called dual process reasoning. Now, I'm not going to go over that big concept, but I'm going to basically tell you what it is. Basically, the idea is in our brains, there are two minds that are fighting for the control of our activities and our daily lives. Now, this had been beautifully articulated in chapter 7 of Romans by Paul. I urge you to read chapter 7 of Paul, and Paul's saying, I just can't believe myself. There are these things I want to do, and I can't do them. There's these things I don't want to do, and I do them every single time. Because this is the person who wrote most of the New Testament. And you know, if he was saying that, we all have issues. I went on this journey to understand my childhood traumas, my past, my relationships with my parents. Why did I act the way I acted? You know, I really began this journey to understand how people get stuck. And in particular, how I had gotten stuck. And how that things that had happened in my past, my childhood traumas, attachments, previous relationships had led to my activities. And as I began to do this, I began to write this book. Now, let me talk a little bit about the book, and let me talk about the chapters in the book. The book is divided into 3 different parts. The first part is called Reflect. The second part, Reframe. The third part, Rewire. In the first part of the book called Reflect, I talk about how we have these 2 minds in one brain, and how our mid to lower brains are really responsible for all of our fears, and how so much of our fears drive our feelings and our behaviors and our thoughts, and how we're even unaware of it, and we think we have free will, but we really don't have free will, and how we find ourselves in these prisons and how I got into the prisons that I got into. But really, from an encouraging perspective, I end part one on the power of our very thoughts to rewire our minds, to help us live free and help us live joyous. In part two of the book, I move into my favorite chapter of the whole book, and it's called What It Means to Be Human. And basically what I talk about in What It Means to Be Human is our basic human condition is that we're alone. And we struggle with this loneliness all of our lives, and we struggle with it in healthy ways, and we struggle with it in destructive ways. I talk about how important morality is. I talk about parenting, and I talk about critical issues of parenting and issues of raising great kids. I have a wonderful, wonderful relationship chapter called It's Not You, It's Me. And I talk about the responsibility that we all have in good relationships, and when it's time to stay in relationships, and when we can't change the relationships. I even have a chapter on the gift of sex and intimacy in this part. So that should keep you really interested. The third part of the book is focused on real change. It goes with an initial chapter called Who Am I? And in this chapter, I give you the tools to, perhaps for the first time, to allow you to introduce you to yourself. The second chapter is called Surrender. Quite often, the only way we can win in life is to surrender. Isn't that ironic? You know, Alcoholics Anonymous talks a lot about this, and really many of the emotional addictions that we've built up all of our lives, in many cases, we have to surrender those addictions so that we can form new and healthy patterns and habits and circuitry in our brain. And finally, the last chapter is called Forgiveness and Freedom. Ultimately, I want you to have a free and joyous life. And that starts with forgiveness. It starts with forgiveness of yourself, forgiveness of others, and ultimately, this entire process allows you to better understand you, to forgive you, to allow you to form new and better ways to live your life, for you to have joyous and free lives, for you to connect with God in a way that you could have never imagined connecting with God. Thank you for listening to me on this beautiful, beautiful evening. And thank you in advance for buying the book. And here's to you. Cheers.